In this video, we're going to be going over naming a computer or naming methods. Now, by default, the system will prompt the user to enter a computer name. But there's several ways that smartImager allows you to automate the process so you don't have to type in a computer name. These include using a unique identifier as the computer name itself, such as a serial number or asset tag. You can use a lookup file, in other words, have smartImager look up a file using the serial number, asset tag, or MAC address to find the computer name and name the computer that way. You can also do a DNS lookup, which is basically using NS lookup to find the computer name via IP address. And you can also run a custom script in order to get the process output from that to use as the computer name. Lastly, if you're doing a reprovisioning of your computer or you're migrating from one operating system to another, you can use the old computer name. So if the computer already has a name, smartImager will look at the computer name, hold that aside, re-image it, and then reuse that name. Before we begin though, I'd like to teach you how smartImager actually names the computer or where it places it. I also want to go in through the order of operations, in other words, when the computer actually gets a name. And lastly, I'd like to approach validation. In other words, how do we validate that the computer name is correct or that it's within given parameters given your naming convention? So to begin, let's go ahead and go over to our server. And on our server, when we installed smartImager, in your repositories, there's an unattended folder. And in that unattended folder, if you look at any of the unattended files that the computer comes with, you can see that there is a line in the specialized pass here, and it says computer name, and then it's a token of asset tag replace, and then in computer name tag, or percent asset tag replace percent. That is a token, and smartImager is going to use this token to replace with the computer name. So if you're ever editing or creating your own unique XML files for smartImager, it's very important that you make sure you add the computer name tag and the asset tag replace token inside that computer name tag so smartImager can effectively name the computer. Now, before we go any further, I would like to discuss naming and where that naming is coming from and when the computer gets named, and really this is the order of operations. So what happens when smartImager boots up for the first time is it'll look for any user prompts. So if there's any custom user prompts you've made, those are going to be consumed first, and then smartImager will evaluate each one of those user prompts before moving on to the next step. That next step is then naming the computer. So if you are creating any custom user prompts, you can't use compatibilities that reference the computer name. So for instance, you can say, I want to prompt the user and ask them what department this is for if the computer name starts with ABC. Well, the problem with this is that while it's prompting the user, the computer name doesn't actually exist. It's given a temporary name by WinPE, and it's something like min.int and then a set of numbers. But that's a temporary name used only until the computer naming comes into place, which is right after the user prompt. So anytime you're creating user prompts, don't use a username compatibility to go through those. So let's head back to our machine here, and we're done with the server. I'm going to go ahead and close that and go into our console. And from here, we want to get into naming methods in components naming methods. So from here, you can see that smartImager started with the default prompt the user for a name. And really, this is about as unautomated as can be because the user is going to have to interact here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new one, and we're going to name this one Lookup from File. And we're going to click Create there. Now the method we want to use is we can use to look up via asset tag, MAC address, or serial number. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say use the serial number to look up the computer name from a file, and then it's going to ask us for that file. And I've already set up some files here, and I'm going to go into them really quickly. And I put them under the Applications repository in a folder named Computer Names, and I'll select the Dell Computer Names text file. Now I'd like to show you that file real quick. If we look in our repositories applications in the Computer Names folder, here's my Dell Computer Names file I've created. On one side I have a series of serial numbers, and on tab delimited I have the computer names, and each serial number is going to be unique, and each computer name is also going to be unique. Now it doesn't have to be a tab delimited file. It could be a comma delimited file, it could be a colon delimited file, or a semicolon rather. It could be a CSV file or a text file. Basically any file which you would normally delimitate 2 columns of data, smartImager will consume that. And the first column is going to be the unique identifier. In this case it's going to be serial numbers, and in the second column is going to be the computer name. So I've used that and said, okay, I'm going to use that as a file, and then pointed to that particular file, and then I click Save. So now any time I image, it's going to look up that file and say, okay, does the serial number exist? And if it does, then look to the computer name next to it and grab that computer name and then name the computer. But I haven't yet set a compatibility on this, so I would need to do that. Otherwise, I would be unsure as to whether or not it was going to prompt or look up from the file, because neither one of those naming methods has a compatibility. So in this case, I'm going to set my compatibility as always true. Now I use an always true and an always false whenever I set up smartImager. That way I know I can force an option to be ahead of another option. In this case, I can force the lookup from file to be before prompting for the name. In other words, if the serial number doesn't exist in the list, then fall back to prompting for a name. And I do that by forcing an always true, and that way it's always going to be true, or the compatibility is always going to be true. Now, real quickly, I'll show you how I made that. If I go to compatibility, and then I look up my always true here, basically it's a WMI query that I say that the name does not equal $$, because that's an illegal computer name. So if it doesn't equal $$, then it must be true. I also do the opposite with always false. I create one that says the computer name equals $$, which is always going to be false. So back to our naming methods here. I did choose a Dell lookup file, so what I could do is I could change this, and I can mark it as Dell, and I can change my compatibility from always true to computer manufacturer is Dell, and basically that's another compatibility I wrote, and now it'll only look it up from that file if the manufacturer is a Dell PC, otherwise it'll prompt for a computer name. I can clone this and do the same thing with HPs, and that's what I'll do now. And I'll just get rid of the word copy here, and I'll point to the other file, which is the HP computer names text, which is just like the Dell's, but it has HP serial numbers. I'll change the compatibility to the manufacturer equals HP, and I'll click Save. So now if I'm imaging a Dell computer, it'll use that file to look up a serial number and get the computer name. If I'm imaging an HP, it'll use the HP file, look up the serial number, get the computer name. And then if it's a Lenovo or something different, then it'll just prompt for a name. Now there's several other things I can do to name the computer. I can also use the serial number directly as the name. If I do this, then whatever the serial number is set in the BIOS, that's going to be my new computer name. I can also do the same thing with an asset tag, and I can also use those identifiers to look up we just use serial number, we can also use the asset tag to look up the file, or we can use MAC address. MAC addresses are a bit harder to come by, a little bit more work, but if you have a list of your MAC addresses in your environment, you can use that as a starter to create a comma-separated file that allows you to assign computer names to each MAC address. We can always use DNS Lookup, but in using the DNS for an IP lookup, you're going to have networking already set up NS Lookup for you. So if NS Lookup isn't already set up in your environment, then DNS Lookup is not a great way to name a computer. If it is set up, it is the fastest and best way to name computers, because that way you're managing them via IP rather than any other item. Using the old computer name, this is if I am reprovisioning a computer or I'm repurposing a computer. I can also use it if I'm migrating a computer, let's say from Windows 7 to Windows 10. I want to keep the same name, and basically I would use this if I wanted to use the old computer name. Lastly, I can use the output from a process as the computer name from a file. Now, the different types of files that it will take are any type of script file. So a batch file, a VB script file, a PowerShell file. One thing to note if I'm using a PowerShell file, so I'll select the getComputerName.ps1, which is my PowerShell file that'll name my computer based upon several parameters. If I'm using this, I need to make sure that PowerShell is in my WinPE stack. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to PowerShell file naming. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to console and bootstrap settings. And from here, I'm going to add the WinPE package for PowerShell. If I don't add the WinPE package for PowerShell, I won't be able to use a PowerShell package in WinPE. In other words, I won't be able to run that PowerShell because the PowerShell script or any other script you're using the output for naming is going to be run in WinPE. By the way, one note, if I add PowerShell, I'm also required to also add NetFX. So if you're adding PowerShell, also add NetFX at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my naming methods here, and I'm going to go back to the PowerShell naming. Now, in this case, I've chosen a script, and I want to use the output from that script to use as the computer name. So anytime I write this script, I must have an output. If there's no output, smartImager can't consume it, and there's no way for smartImager to know what the computer name should be. Lastly, I want to talk to you about validation. It doesn't matter what type of naming method I'm using, I can validate it to make sure that it is an actual valid computer name for whatever naming convention you're using. Now, by default, the validation is going to be a regular expression, which is the Microsoft Windows validation. In other words, it must be somewhere less than 14 characters, can't include like question marks or funny characters. This validation here basically says that it's a valid Windows computer name, but that may not necessarily be a valid name for your naming convention. Basically, you just need to write a regular expression that is your naming convention validation, and smartImager will check it and check every single name against that validation before it names the computer. If you don't know how to write a regular expression to do this, you can always hit us up at support@smartimager.com, and we would be happy to write that for you. And if you have any other questions, just email us at contactus@smartimager.com. So that's it for the naming methods. If you ever need any support at all, once again, it's support@smartimager.com.